Good morning. So we're starting our next unit here in biology called ecology. Some of you are probably wondering what ecology is. Um, Ecology is the study of the interactions between organisms and their environment. So this could be investigating the interactions between humans and the environment, or different groups of organisms with other groups of organisms, and the interaction between biotic and abiotic factors in the environment. Pretty relevant part of each ecology that's macroscopic for the most part, that you can see. It should make sense, and it should impact your life in some way. So this is one of my favorite units of study because it's something that I can see when I go outside and go hunting or fishing and those kinds of things. Uh, Science has always been really interesting to me because as I can make those connections between what I learn in a classroom and then see it outside, it makes it a little bit more meaningful. And so hopefully we can get you guys to that point as well. So what's this levels of organization business? So to talk about the environment, the biologists have to kind of organize what they want to talk about. And so they start with kind of big picture systems and work down to smaller and smaller systems of interactions. And we'll start with the biggest and work our way smaller and smaller. And so you've probably heard this word before, biosphere. The word itself is pretty self-explanatory. Bio means life. Sphere is obviously this round circle. And so the biosphere is looking at the living components of the Earth. So the Earth is this, big system, obviously. In Earth science focused on the geosphere. So the rocks and the volcanoes and the earthquakes and the climate, everything that's not alive. And so in this class, we'll focus on the biosphere. So what can we learn about the interactions between organisms on a global scale and their environment? So an example of that might be, how is climate change affecting where we find life on Earth? Or is life moving around? Or how is it changing? Those kinds of questions. As we get smaller in the levels of organization, then the next level, what we would say, is a biome. So a biome is a group of ecosystems, and a biome is defined by, for the most part, abiotic factors. So when I say the word abiotic, I mean not living. And so climate is this not living component of our Earth, but it has a huge impact on the kinds of organisms that can live there. If you look at this picture, we have a desert landscape. So we would say this is a desert biome. And so those temperature and precipitation averages really dictate the kinds of organisms, the animals, and the plants that can live in this environment. Working down below biome, we get into something that you've probably heard of before, an ecosystem. So an ecosystem is all the organisms in a place along with the physical environment. So how is this different than a biome? Let's think about the South Hills of Helena as an example of an ecosystem. So an ecosystem is going to be this physical place. So south of Helena, we have kind of a hilly environment. There are some pretty dry drainages or draws that sometimes have a little bit of water in the bottom. Sometimes they're dry. So we call that an ephemeral stream. And we have these trees, the ponderosa pine. We have some sagebrush or rabbit brush, grasses, and then we have a bunch of organisms that live in the South Hills, like deer and mountain lions and rabbits and squirrels and those sorts of things, and how all those organisms interact in a place. We would call this an ecosystem. So sometimes we could talk about a pretty small ecosystem, sometimes maybe a large ecosystem, like the ecosystem of the Amazon rainforest, for example, which is this huge ecosystem. So it's a little bit different than biome because a biome, the South Hills, is much smaller than maybe this semi-arid biome that we live in, grassland, um, mountain biome. Um, so think of ecosystem as just kind of a smaller piece of that biome, but an important part of it is how is the ecosystem includes the physical environment still. So thinking about that it's not flat, it's hilly, it's got different aspects. We're going to have different kinds of vegetation on different aspects that receive less sun so the soil doesn't dry out as much, those sorts of things. Um, so working on down, you take a guess at what the next level is. What would be smaller than an ecosystem on a systems approach to studying ecology? The next one is a community. So a community is an assemblage of different populations. So the key difference between community and ecosystem is now we're really focusing on one, well, not one, but the organisms, the groups of organisms that live in an area. So in this picture here, we have a community of looks like lions, and then we have buffalo here, and so we would include the population of lions, we would include the population of buffalo and other populations that are in this immediate area. So the idea with a community is that these groups of organisms are now interacting. So the ecosystem kind of defines, what kinds of organisms we might find here. And then how these organisms interact, that's really when you start getting into ecological studies. How does this lion, the predator, affect the prey? And why are there so many of the prey species and so few of the lion species? And we'll try to understand what's going on there and make sense of it. Moving on down in the levels of organization, our next group is a population. So now instead of having two different groups like we did that were interacting in the last slide, now we're focusing on just one species. And so here we have a bunch of penguins, and with a population we can talk about how many organisms are there. So there's this group of penguins, and we want to know, biologists do, how many are there. Is the population increasing or is it decreasing, and why? Is there too many organisms in this place, and how does that affect the environment? We can get into things like overgrazing and bad things that can happen if you have too many of a specific organism in the same place at the same time. So we don't have penguins around here, but we'll focus on some of the populations that we have in Montana, like the elk, one of my favorites. And so on the smallest level of organization, as we went all the way from the biosphere, all the life on planet Earth, which is just amazing how much life there is on this planet, all the way down to individual species. And so this is different than a population because a population is this group of the same species, but now we're talking really just this individual organism. And what does it mean to be a species? How does species develop? Why do we find elk? Why are they here? What is their role in the environment? What's their life history? What do they do? So we study them, learn about them to understand them. And then we can, as ecologists, biologists, land managers, make decisions that affect the well-being of this species. And so the technical definition of a species is if an individual can successfully reproduce and the offspring is fertile. So that's a key definition, how biologists define what a species is, because some groups of organisms can reproduce and have offspring, but their offspring might not be able to have babies. So an example of that is a mule. So if you have a horse and a donkey that have a baby, which can happen, a mule can't have more mules. It just doesn't work. So genetically, the offspring isn't viable, and so we would stop. We wouldn't call a mule, its own species. It's just this like genetically infertile offspring of a donkey and a horse, and so that's where we draw the line with different species. Now, biologists nowadays really turn to genetics to look at the differences between species and study the genome of organisms and really the sequences of the DNA molecule that really make the organism have all the traits that it has. And so this definition I have here is a bit older, but still valid, and now they turn more to genetic evidence for species identification. All right, hopefully this was enlightening. Thanks.